No, what'd you say?
When I was streaming, did you hear me?
No,
Okay.
I didn't.
All right, go ahead and share my screen, play the video.
And while sitting there autographing books, a demented black woman came up. The only question I heard from her was, "You, Martin Luther King?" And I was looking down writing, and I said, "Yes." The next minute, I felt something beating on my chest. Before I knew it, I had been stabbed by this demented woman. I was rushed to Harlem Hospital. It was a dark Saturday afternoon. That blade had gone through, and the x-rays revealed that the tip of the blade was on the edge of my aorta, the main artery. And once that's punctured, you're drowned in your own blood. That's the end of you. It came out in the New York Times the next morning that if I had merely sneezed, I would have died. Well, about 4 days later, they allowed me, after the operation, after my chest had been opened and the blade had been taken out, to move around in the wheelchair in the hospital. They allowed me to read some of the mail that came in, and from all over the states and the world, kind letters came in. I read a few, but one of them I will never forget. I had received one from the president and the vice president. I've forgotten what those telegrams said. I received a visit and a letter from the governor of New York, but I've forgotten what that letter said. But there was another letter that came from a little girl, a young girl, who was a student at the White Plains High School. And I looked at that letter, and I'll never forget it. It said simply, "Dear Dr. King, I am a 9th grade student at the White Plains High School." She said, "While it should not matter, I would like to mention that I'm a white girl. I read in the paper of your misfortune and of your suffering. And I read that if you had sneezed, you would have died. I'm simply writing you to say that I'm so happy that you didn't sneeze. I want to say tonight that I too am happy that I didn't sneeze, because if I had sneezed, I wouldn't have been around here in 1960. And students all over the South started sitting in at lunch hours. And I knew that as they were sitting in, they were really standing up for the best in the American dream, and taking the whole nation back to those great wells of democracy, which were dug deep by the founding fathers in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. If I had sneezed, I wouldn't have been around here in 1962. The Negroes in Albany, Georgia, decided to straighten their backs up. And whenever men and women straighten their backs up, they are going somewhere, because a man can't ride your back unless it is bent. If I had sneezed, I wouldn't have been here in 1963. Black people of Birmingham, Alabama, aroused the conscience of this nation and brought into being the Civil Rights Bill. If I had sneezed, I wouldn't have had a chance later that year in August to try to tell America about a dream that I had had. If I had sneezed, I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
Good evening, everyone. Want to share that short video to remind us all of the sacrifice that Martin Luther King made for all Americans, Black, white, brown, yellow. I thought it was very imperative to share that with everyone tonight while we prepare for Mr. Knowles to hit us with some Black history facts. Traditional narratives have either omitted or minimized the historical contributions of Black people. During this series, we will explore history of African people on the continent and throughout the entire diaspora. Together, we will implore a dispositional shift where our stories stretch beyond an oppressive centered conceptual framework. I am your host, Latasha Clemens, first vice president of the National Coalition of 100 Black Women. And before we get started, I want to remind everybody to complete the registration form that's going to be in the on the link. Also, send an email to pbccbsa@gmail.com. That's pbccbsa@gmail.com. At this time, let's take a moment of silence to honor the ancestors, the named and unnamed victims of racism, as well as those who put themselves in danger to keep us safe. Medical personnel, nurses, doctors, first responders, and all the underpaid people that are working face to face so that many of us can work from home. Moment of silence, please. Thank you. We will have comments by Dr. Robinson.
Well, thank you, Latasha. It is really, in many ways, to me, it's a solemn day. The video reminded me that I was an 8-year-old, but I was there at that March on Washington. I point to the picture and tell my children, see, that's me right there. I didn't really know the magnitude of what was going on around me, but I knew that we were in the struggle, right? And we're still in the struggle. And what the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s words just said to me is, we can't lose hope. And we must straighten up our backs, right? Things are nowhere near where they should be. They're not where they used to be. We have people who are saying the right words. The word I hear all the time is equity. But if we go back to that speech, he talked about a check, right? A check that was marked non-sufficient funds. I'm still waiting on my check, right? And if you look at the education system, and I've been looking at data today, all day today, looking at data on how the education system is not serving Black children. And, Gloria Ladson Billings wrote a paper called The Education Debt. And she was talking about that check, right? She was talking about that check that has not been able to be cashed, the investments in Black folks that never took place despite our investment in this country, right? And so as frustrated as I get and as sad as I get sometimes, I am not going to lose hope, because I know so many, including some of those outstanding men in your background there, Latasha, so many, named and unnamed, right? Seen and unseen, sacrificed in large and small ways to give us the opportunity to take the baton that they passed to us and keep running in this marathon. And so that's what we're going to do, right? And so for all of us who know that we're in the struggle, well, let's work together, because each of us has something to offer, so that one day that we can cash that check and we can get to true equity in whatever realm we're talking about. I'm focused on the education realm, but there's a lot of different areas of inequity and injustice, and all of them need to be addressed. And so, on this day where we honor this great man, let us honor him on a go forward basis to come together and work on these issues and speak truth to power. I appreciate you. Thank you.
Thank you for those comments, Dr. Robinson. Again, as you see on the background behind my image, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but that of the silence of our friends. They said it back then, it still holds true today. Let's speak truth to power and let's move forward. Listen, Mr. Brian Knowles, I am always excited to introduce this young man, Mr. Brian Knowles. Mr. Brian Knowles has a background because he is the manager of Office of African American, Latino, I gotta take my time saying this, Holocaust and Gender Studies of the Palm Beach County School District. Mr. Brian Knowles, you have the floor, sir.
Thank you, my sisters. Peace and love, everybody. Peace and blessings. I welcome you all here, as we're here to celebrate and commemorate the life and legacy of the one and only Dr. King. I want to kind of do something different. I want to start off with a video before I kind of get into the presentation. So I think I need you to allow me to share my screen, Latasha.
Okay, you should be able to at this point.
Okay. Let's see something here. Still can't do it for some reason. They're not able to, Latasha.
Okay, it says here that my screen is off. It says multiple participants can share simultaneously, so you should be able to share.
I'm going here. Hold on 1 second. So what I'm going to do is go to gallery view here. Hopefully I can get in here because it's still not allowing me to. Share. Oh, here we go. Perfect. Here we go. Right here. All right, Latasha, I just need you to tell me, can you see the screen? You see a video that's up here?
Yep, excellent.
All right. Do we hear video, audio?
Go ahead and play it.
It's playing now.
I don't hear audio on my end.
You hear audio? Okay. All right, just want to make sure we got audio here. All right, so I'm going to play this right here. So I'm going to start off with this video because when we talk about narratives, one thing that is always done with our history is that our narratives are always twisted. And Dr. King, his life and legacy and just his contributions is not an exception to that. So when we talk about, just like I said, when we talk about these narratives and think about how a story is painted, sometimes we get a distorted perception of Dr. King. So even when I came up with this title, Rethinking the Life and Legacy of Dr. King, I just wanted to make sure that I brought a more accurate total portrayal of Dr. King and the things that he did during his life here. Not in a negative way, because some people kind of took that title in a negative way, but we're talking about a positive way. We're talking about a holistic approach of looking at Dr. King and his life and legacy. So I'm going to start off with this short, brief video clip of Dr. King, and just kind of as we move forward into this conversation, this discussion tonight, and how we're going to reshape or reframe how we view Dr. King and looking at Dr. King for the true revolutionary, reformer, and radical that he actually was.
I can't hear it, Brian. Brian?
Sasha, you all can't hear that video?
No, I couldn't hear your video.
Okay, no, just forget it. I'm gonna skip the video and just kind of move forward. We're having all kinds of technical issues, and I just want to move forward to it. So it's all good.
Excellent.
So all right, so I'm just gonna move right into the presentation this evening. All right, so we seeing a PowerPoint here? Yes?
Yes.
Okay. All right, so rethinking the life and legacy of Dr. King. So, all right, so for some of us who haven't been here before, I want to kind of just give a brief overview as far as what is the overall goal of the Office of African American, Latino, Holocaust, and Gender Studies. What do we do throughout our school district? Some of the things that Dr. Robertson mentioned is just right on point as far as some of the things that I'm going to bring about Dr. King, and as far as what do we do within our educational system about attaining true equity, because that's one of those buzzwords that is used throughout education. Even that word equity, equality, multiculturalism, and diversity, and all of these buzzwords that are currently used in education, which are not accurately used, that are used completely out of context. Yes, when we talk about education, our educational system is one of those racist systems of oppression that is not serving Black children by any means. It's causing a disservice to Black children. And one of those ways of causing a disservice is the way that they teach our history, or lack thereof of teaching our history. So now we have this work that I'm honored and blessed to lead with our office. And part of this work is to reform teaching and learning by creating an educational foundation where all students are affirmed and validated. When we say affirmed and validated, Black children have not been affirmed and validated in our educational system. Our history, our culture, our perspectives, our values, just our true way of existing has not been affirmed, because we've not even been affirmed in American society as whole, and our humanity has not been identified or recognized even within a society. And we can see that by current events and how, just the double standard and just the white privilege and white power that exists in our society, and just how we're usually killed without retribution in our society, and our humanity. Sometimes I can't even articulate it, just due to just the sheer frustration of that. So one of the ways that we can affirm and validate people of Black people in our society is that, first of all, we can normalize in teaching the histories, incorporating the culture of all of our students in the classroom. When I say normalize, I place a strong emphasis on normalization, meaning our history is beyond February. The life and legacy and the impact of Dr. King is well beyond the month of January. We're still working within the school system where people are just really trying to even approach the topic and making sure that we can normalize and incorporate our history within our curriculum. Right now, we're talking about January, halfway through a school year. So we must normalize in teaching our history within our classroom. We must transform curriculum where all students can develop an understanding of the experiences, perspectives of different racial, cultural, ethnic, religious, and gender groups, and also support educators and implementing pedagogical strategies that address the cultural norms and learning preferences of a diverse student population. Here in Palm Beach County, even in public school districts throughout our country, the majority of those students are Black and brown, but yet we still have a conceptual framework and approach of assimilating those children. We still approach education as if that we need to fix Black children by forcing them to assimilate into a dominant culture what is not natural or indigenous to them. We have to rethink our foundations and rethink the narratives. So first of all, rethinking our starting points. Our history did not start with slavery, and it's not oppressive centered framework that we need to continue that approach, but we must shift away from that approach and understand that our history extends to the very beginning of human civilization. We also need to shift away from an oppressive centered conceptual framework. Throughout world history and throughout American history, Black people have not always been overcoming something. Our oppression and the negative aspects of our history did not really come on board until European imperialism and colonialism, and also through the Arabic slave trade, which existed before European colonialism as well. But we got to understand that there are positive aspects of our history. There's history where we have exhibited strength. There are aspects of our history where we have exhibited that we've been contributors and progenitors of the sciences, the math, the mathematics, architecture, and all aspects of human civilization. And also making sure that our history includes the contributions of the entire African diaspora. We must understand that African people go beyond just the United States, that we're people throughout the Caribbean, South America, Latin America, and also the European continent and other parts of this planet. Also, our history is not peripheral or isolated from the larger historical narrative. We are American history, we are world history, and our history is non-linear, that we have a complex history that is very complicated, that is very dynamic, that is so much that you can unpack and evaluate from our history, and our historical narratives needs to be fixed to address that. So first of all, as we hear to MLK, just give on MLK Day as a federal holiday, just kind of go back just a little bit and see where that came from. First of all, Dr. King is the first modern private citizen to be honored with a federal holiday. The first push for a King holiday took place actually 4 days after his assassination in 1968 by John Connors, who was a Democratic congressman from Michigan. So we see the further push in the 1970s by the Congressional Black Caucus, and by the early 1980s, the push for Dr. King to be honored as a federal holiday took traction or took hold in the 1980s. As the Congressional Black Caucus collected 6 million signatures. And also we even have people like Stevie Wonder, who wrote a hit song, which was on actually one of my favorite albums by Stevie Wonder, called Hotter Than July, called Happy Birthday. And actually all of that together drove the public support for the holiday. So we see the first federal holiday celebrated in 1986. But we must remember that there was resistance to this. So you had several southern states that actually came together, and what they did on the same day as we celebrated Dr. King, as they uplifted Confederate leader Robert E. Lee, who was actually born 4 days after Dr. King, to kind of offset just the way that we celebrated him. And actually we must understand also, it wasn't even to the year 2000 that every state in the United States observed Martin Luther King Jr. Day as a federal holiday. All right, so I'm going to go back a little bit, and I'm going to make the connection to today. I kind of like always kind of go back so we can move forward. Last month in December, we talked about just some of the misconceptions and some of the myths when it comes to African American history. And we talked about the story of Sister Rosa Parks, how we need to reframe that narrative and just kind of come with a whole different approach to Rosa Parks and the things that she did, and just understand that her efforts during the Montgomery bus boycott and during the civil rights movement was a concerted, very intentional effort by a radical Black woman. So I found this quote from David Eichert, who was a professor at Vanderbilt University, and what he said about Rosa Parks, and I'm going to make this direct connection to Dr. King today. First of all, what he said, it is a lot easier to digest an old grandmother with tired feet. Grandmothers are not scary, but young radical Black women who don't take stuff from anybody are very scary. Those who stand up to power and are willing to die for it, those are not the type of people that make us comfortable. We must understand when we talk about Dr. King, young radical Black man who didn't take anything from anybody, was very scary. He was willing to stand up to power, and he was willing to die for it, which he did. So when we talk about young, he was a young Black man. Dr. King was assassinated before the age of 30. He died when he was in 39. He took the mantle of leadership in the civil rights movement during the Montgomery Bus Improvement Association when he was only 26 years old. So we must understand that, first of all, Dr. King was a young man. And on top of that, Dr. King was a very radical, revolutionary, very scary man to the power structure and to those who want to perpetuate and uphold institutional structural racism. So today we're going to explore Dr. King from a different angle. Sometimes we take Dr. King and we like to compare him to what people like to call his polar opposite in Malcolm X. And we try to make that comparison as if we're talking about two different ideologies, two completely different people. One was radical, one was peaceful. Some people say, Malcolm X was the violent one, when Martin Luther King was the peaceful, nonviolent one. But there was so much error in those statements. First of all, when we talk about Malcolm X, well, which would dive into his life and legacy during the month of May, during when actually Malcolm X's birthday is May 19th. So we're going to commemorate him and kind of trying to rethink and reapproach his legacy in the month of May. But Malcolm X was not associated with any violence by any means. But what we're going to find out in this talk is that when it comes to their ideologies, maybe not always their approach and their public approach, but their ideologies and what the radical nature of both individuals were more common than they were different. So first of all, we must unlearn and relearn Dr. King, like everything within our history. We have to do a whole lot of unlearning so we can start to relearn to get a full scope and a new narrative and a new conceptual thinking to our history. First of all, we must understand, just like all aspects of our history, King is kept within a certain space, right? That's on a digestible, a palatable timeline or narrative where the African-American struggle, first of all, is stuck within the constraints of the 20th century. So whenever we talk about the struggle for equality of Black people's concerted and organized efforts to dismantle racism and get the demon of oppression off of our back, we usually kind of stick that within the 20th century. First of all, we start in 1909 with the NAACP. Then we jump all the way to 1954 with Brown versus the Board of Education. Then we get to 1955 with the Montgomery bus boycott. Then we get to like 1963 where we get the Birmingham campaign where Martin Luther King wrote his famous letter, the letter from the Birmingham jail. Then we get to the March on Washington, which took place that summer in 63. Then we jump to 1968 with his assassination. And for some reason, just the civil rights movement and just African-American history just kind of falls off a cliff for some reason. But we must understand, that's just this box, all right, that Eurocentric mind, Eurocentric conceptual way of thinking puts our history within. First of all, Black people had organized efforts to dismantle racism, mistreatment, and just our very violations of our human rights, and just the American society just not even identifying our very humanity. We've been doing that since colonial America. Matter of fact, we've been doing that since the coast of Africa when Europeans came to kidnap us from West Africa. But what all of this does is that it minimizes the intentional organization led by Black people. All right, in this case, and in a specific case of Dr. King, it creates a narrative where the entire scope of his work is not told in its entirety. In addition, this is a palatable way to that we're conditioned by this racist ideologies and also a Eurocentric way of thinking, like I said before. When we take this approach of history that is digestible and is palatable and is safe and it's not scary, it does nothing to challenge white supremacy or the erroneous thought that Black people are resilient, that Black people are perseverant, that Black people are revolutionary and warriors, that we're not just the Sambo that history is trying to paint us to be, as if we just accept just the conditions that white people place us in. So what we must understand is when we say Dr. King, is that Dr. King, first of all, is considered one of the most dangerous people was considered one of the most dangerous people to the power structure. His way of thinking still is probably one of the most dangerous waves of ideologies and philosophies to the power structure that we know exists today. Some people try to kind of put Dr. King in his box and minimize his role because his relationship, religion, and the Christian church. Because sometimes we've been taught this idea, even within some Afrocentric thinking circles, that it was Christianity or it was the white man's religion that formed us into this passive role. First of all, we must understand, and this is something I'm not going to fully unpack in this conversation, is that's one of those myths. So first of all, that Christianity was given to us, or religion was given to Black people to control us. In some aspects, yes, but for the most part, you must understand when we start really digging into the history of religion and even the history specifically of Christianity, we would see that at first, some of the earliest churches that organized in the Christian church actually was organized in the African continent. So you even think so one of the first nations to actually formalize Christianity as is a state religion was Ethiopia. And that actually was existed way before Europeans fully adopted Christianity or converted to Christianity. But also we must understand that it was the Christian church that played a huge role in dismantling racism. We must understand that religion itself, going all the way back to the Nat Turner slave insurrection, that it was just the influence of religion itself that gave Black people their faith, that gave Black people the confidence to step forward and to step forth at some time to fight their power structure itself. And we must understand also, when we say Christianity in the context of the African American community, just like other religions such as Islam, and as we start to unpack Malcolm X's legacy, that we'll find out those religions itself adopted so much to our culture. And that's the versions and the way that it played out in our communities is very different from its original roots in Asia. So I'm going to start with this quote right here. And I'm going to give a few throughout this talk today. And this right here is going to really display the radical, just a warrior, and just how bold and courageous Dr. King was. So in 1956, right in the midst of the Montgomery bus boycott, this is a quote from Dr. King. Actually, he was quoted saying this after there was a batch of unexploded dynamite found on his doorstep. And Dr. King said this: "Tell Montgomery they can keep shooting, and I'm going to stand up to them. Tell Montgomery that they can keep bombing, and I'm going to stand up to them. If I had to die tomorrow morning, I would be happy because I've been to the mountaintop and I've seen the promised land, and it's going to be here in Montgomery. The old Montgomery is passing away." So right there, you look at that quote, that's a radical quote. That's a radical statement by a radical Black man. First of all, you must understand that he didn't take this approach like people say usually of Christian pastors, that we're going to get this promise, so we're going to kind of reach this heaven in the hereafter. But Dr. King stated that the promised land that he was hoping for, that he envisioned, was not going to be in heaven. It's not going to be after death, but this is going to be something right here on earth. And if he had to die for it, he would die for it. And as we know, Dr. King did die for it. This is a radical statement. And this right here should start shifting that perception that we have of Dr. King, this misconception, this misperception that we have of Dr. King. So just a little background. So first of all, between 1955 and 1965, which is like the typical years that we kind of put this box in Dr. King's career, all right? 1955 started when he was chosen as leadership with the Montgomery Improvement Association. And kind of go a little bit before that, we must understand that Dr. King graduated from Morehouse College in 1948. And he was born in 1929. So he was graduated from college by the age of 1929, he was born. So 18 or something like 19 years old that when he finished with his bachelor's degree. He actually went to Crozer Theological Seminary in Chester, Pennsylvania. Then he attended graduate school at Boston University. Then eventually he becomes the lead pastor at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery by 1954. It was in December of 1955 when he was chosen to be the head of the Montgomery Improvement Association. What happened is also that we must understand that it was not King who organized that, but he was chosen to lead the Montgomery Improvement Association because his oratory skills and his ability to communicate and articulate the needs and demands of the Black community to the white power structure. It was people like E.D. Nixon, it was people like Rosa Parks and Joan Robinson Gibson who actually spearheaded that movement. So also, whenever you talk about the context of Dr. King also, and to talk about his life and influence, one of the people that always has to be mentioned as an influential individual to Dr. King's life and his life as a civil rights leader was Bayard Rustin. It was in 1956 when Dr. King met Bayard Rustin, and that encounter would forever change Dr. King. Matter of fact, when Bayard Rustin said when he first met Dr. King had loaded guns all over his home. We all know that Dr. King was influenced by the nonviolent approach of Gandhi, but it wasn't until Bayard Rustin that he fully accepted that pacifist view of nonviolent approach. And so it wasn't really until like 1958 that we see Dr. King fully espousing the nonviolent approach after he visited India to further study Gandhi's approach of nonviolent resistance when Gandhi used that of decolonization of India from the British. So also, what also happens in 1957 is that Dr. King helped organize the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, also known as the SCLC. In 1960, is that when he goes back to his hometown, Atlanta, and he becomes the co-pastor of Ebenezer Baptist Church under his father. Also, we see in 1963 during the Birmingham campaign to fight segregation and just the mistreatment of Black people in the city of Birmingham, Alabama, that when he gets arrested, he writes his famous letter from Birmingham jail in 1963. During the summer of 63, that's the March on Washington, where he delivers his famous I Have a Dream speech. Then in 1964, at 35 years old, Martin Luther King Jr. becomes the youngest man to receive a Nobel Peace Prize. Then it was 1965 that he organized a second march from Selma to Montgomery. The first one was Bloody Sunday, led by John Lewis. And we know the results of that at the Pettus Bridge. But it was the second one that Dr. King was present that he helped organize. So now the purpose of this, and we're going to talk about the bigger scope of today's talk, is that we want to kind of get out of that box from 1954, 55 to 1965. All right, so post 1965, we see Dr. King take a more radical approach. All right, we see him first of all take a more anti-militarism approach, also an anti-American capitalism approach, and also an anti-racist approach, which he already had before, but he kind of boxed all these things together. So what happened is that as the United States got involved in the Vietnam War, Dr. King became very outspoken against that. So what he actually said, that there is no doubt in my mind and in the minds of the world that we had no honorable intentions in Vietnam. And he was very explicit and he was very candid about the United States criticism of building up military and participate in what we know as the Vietnam War, or the conflict in Vietnam. And also, one of the things that King really pushed for during post-1965 is that King called for the United States to undergo a radical revolution of values, right? He wanted to look at how our approach to capitalism and just the self-interest that is at the center of American capitalism, and how when it came to poverty, when it came to mistreatment, and all of those different aspects, and how just our whole approach and just the value system in America was perpetuating some of those things. When he said also, when a machine and computers are profit motives and property rights are considered more important than people, the giant triplets of racism, materialism, and militarism are incapable of being conquered. So one of the things also that Dr. King was quoted as saying is a nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death. Even though he took a radical approach, he was still ethical, and he was still had a spiritual foundation in this approach. Here are some of the things that Dr. King was quoted as saying, all right, here directly. First of all, we must recognize that we cannot solve our problems now until there's a radical redistribution of economic and political power. The whole structure of American life must be changed. Then he goes on to say this, and this is something that Dr. Robinson said. We're talking about a check bouncing and writing a check for all the suffering of Black people in this country. You can't talk about solving the economic problem of the Negro without talking about billions of dollars. Now we're talking about a redistribution of wealth in this country, a redistribution of political power in this country. And we're talking about changing the very structure and fabric of American life as we know it. And Dr. King was the one who said these words, very radical. Matter of fact, we must remember that Dr. King at heart, as far as his political values, is that he was democratic socialist. He believed in a redistribution of wealth. He wasn't a communist. You know, even today in 2021, when you start saying the word socialism or democratic socialism, that is very scary, and a lot of people don't want to hear that word. But Dr. King understood that one of the things that happened after the emancipation of the end of slavery in 1865 is that there was no wealth distributed to all of these Black people that were now free. So he understood also that it took a distribution of wealth, or it took some kind of reparations that was going to really solve and bring any kind of equity or equality in American society. And Dr. King in the 1960s was very vocal of that, and very willing to challenge that structure. So when we talk about Dr. King and we approach Dr. King, we hear about the I Have a Dream speech and his nonviolent approach, but we don't really talk about his ideologies and his approach as far as restructuring American society and also challenging our economic system. When you start talking about money and starting to challenge big businesses and industry in this country, you start treading on dangerous grounds. And Dr. King recognized that and identified that. But because he was so bold and resilient and courageous, that he challenged that and vocalized that openly. Another aspect of Dr. King's life and career is that we don't really talk about the Poor People's Campaign. It was Dr. King in 1968, the year that he was assassinated, that King believed that economic security was the key to citizenship. And he also advocated for legislation for anti-poverty, full employment, guaranteed income, and affordable housing. And what happened is that earlier under the Lyndon B. Johnson is that Dr. King identified something called the war on poverty was a complete failure. And as the United States dug deeper into the Vietnam War and got deeper into that conflict, we found ourselves spending more money on building up our military and more money on that conflict, and started to shift away from social programs, especially when these social programs, we found that, first of all, you can't separate race and poverty. Some people say that issues in this country are not about race, it's about poverty. You can't separate the two. All right, we must understand that racism and we must understand that capitalism is predicated on racism. So King identified that and understood the failure. So what King wanted to do is reform to revolution. That was actually his words, that we were going to reform this country by revolution. So as we're starting to shift and look at the radical thought process of Dr. King, and understand where Dr. King saw the core in American values that would lead into the perpetuation of the problems of racism, of just some of the moral, ethical ills of this country. That the heart of it was, yes, racism, but the heart of it was capitalism. The heart of it was just the exploitation of the poor. So one of the things that he said is that we moved from an era of civil rights to an era of human rights. So even during the Poor People's Campaign, one of his goals was to build an entire tent city on a mall in Washington, where he was going to organize American Indians, Puerto Rican, Mexican Americans, and also poor white communities to support the Poor People's Campaign and build a tent city in Washington, D.C. And we know that our government was very afraid of that. They were very afraid of bringing poor, unified people across all lines of culture, race, and ethnicity together to challenge the power structure. Now, does this paint a different picture of the person that our textbooks and schools paint Dr. King to be? It's a complete different picture. This is a radical, this is a revolutionary, this is someone who is willing to challenge the very structure and fabric of American society. So sometimes we keep Dr. King within that 55 to 65 box, and we just look at it as Dr. King just wished for integration, right? And we must understand also, what did Dr. King say about integration? Here's a direct quote from Dr. King. I've come upon something that disturbs me deeply. We fought hard and long for integration, as I believe we should have, and I know we will win. But I've come to believe that we are integrating into a burning house. I'm afraid that America has lost the moral vision she may have had. And I'm afraid that even as we integrate, we are walking to a place that does not understand this nation needs to be deeply concerned with the plight of the poor and disenfranchised. Until we commit ourselves to ensuring that the underclass is given justice and opportunity, we will continue to perpetuate the anger and violence that tears the soul of this nation. I fear I am integrating my people into a burning house. Dr. King was even, we must even understand when Dr. King spoke about integration, it was not that he thought that Black people would do better sitting next to white people in schools, etc. Not saying anything is wrong with that. I'm not criticizing that. But what the core of Dr. King's fight in his life and legacy was for equal opportunity and access for Black people. And what Dr. King started to fully notice is that for us to get true opportunity and access, that these economic issues in this country had to be evaluated, reevaluated, and had to be challenged. So as we see Dr. King shift from civil rights to human rights, and we understand that human rights and economic issues were deeply intertwined with each other, that we must understand that Dr. King had to take a whole different approach, a different stance. So what happens is that from 55 to 65, that box of Dr. King's life, first of all, not the whole entire narrative within those 10 years is usually told. But what happens is that it's safe. It is not scary to paint Dr. King in this way. And Dr. King was very nonviolent. He had core spiritual beliefs that he carried throughout his struggle and throughout his resistance. And yes, he predicated upon love and ethics and morals. But we must understand that Dr. King wanted a full reevaluation and revolution of American society and our values itself that are usually not spoke of when we talk about Dr. King and about changing the very narrative and approach that Dr. King had. So as I wrap up and I close out tonight, I hope that we've kind of just opened what I like to call Pandora's box when it talks about Dr. King and many leaders who came after him, because there's so much that we can unpack throughout this series. But specifically for this space, as we celebrate Dr. King, we must understand that Dr. King was a true reformer. He was a true radical, true revolutionary. And one of the things that I always say to people, because there are people that usually debate that Dr. King they have these that he was an Uncle Tom. I've heard all of it. So first of all, if Dr. King was not as effective and he was his Uncle Tom, like people would like to say, Dr. King would not have been assassinated. I see all real Black leaders who actually push for real change, sustainable change, and effective change and radical change are always taken out. Either they're assassinated or the FBI makes sure they take them down. We go all the way back to Marcus Garvey, and we fast forward to people like Harry T. Moore, Medgar Evers, Malcolm X, Dr. King, Fred Hampton, and the list can go on. So now I hope just during this conversation that we're taking a different approach and just we see Dr. King from a different light and see Dr. King for the true radical and revolutionary that he was. So thank you.
Brian, if you want to go ahead and stop your screen, I'll go ahead and share your video and you can comment on your video and then we'll go to closing comments.
All right, I'm going to try to play it.
I'm going to play it for you.
Perfect, thank you.
Many of the people who supported us in Selma, in Birmingham, were really outraged about the extremist behavior toward Negroes. But they were not at that moment, and they are not now, committed to genuine equality for Negroes. It's much easier to integrate a lunch counter than it is to guarantee an annual income, for instance, to get rid of poverty for Negroes and all poor people. It's much easier to integrate a bus than it is to make genuine integration a reality and quality education a reality in our schools. It's much easier to integrate even a public park than it is to get rid of slums. And I think we are in a new era, a new phase of the struggle, where we have moved from a struggle for decency, which characterized our struggle for 10 or 12 years, to a struggle for genuine equality.
And that is a struggle, Mika, we are still in 53 years later.
Yeah, it's the late Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. speaking to NBC News approximately 1 year before he was assassinated in in 1968. Look at us now. Joining us now, Martin Luther King III. He is chairman of the board of the Drum Major Institute and a global human rights leader. DMI was founded by Dr. King, and it carries on his legacy through the organization. Also with us, president of the Drum Major Institute, Andrea King. She's host of MSNBC's Politics Nation and president of the National Action Network. Reverend Al Sharpton joins us as well. Good to have you all on board this morning.
Dr. King, I'd asked earlier.
Brian, go ahead and comment. You're muted.
Thank you, Latasha. That wasn't the video, but that's good too, because some of the things that Dr. King discussed in that video, that video clip, was how it's just about economic equality, and some of the things that was perfect too, Natasha. So thank you. But some of the things that he said is that when we were emancipated from slavery, or so-called emancipated, semi-emancipated from slavery in the 1860s. Is that you had certain radical Republicans who introduced the whole concept of 5 acres and a mule. But what happened is that our federal government refused to do that, because you had some Republicans in office who understood that the only way that we were going to attain any true equality or any kind of full citizenship is through economics. But what happened is that our federal government refused to do that. But simultaneously during that time period is that our federal government was giving out thousands upon thousands of acres of land to white people for simply being white during that time period, because they understood just where power would lie and where equality and full citizenship would reside within economics. And that was one of the many aspects and examples in history where white Americans and white people, for simply just existing and being white, were given a head start with a front of us economically. And we know with so much with economics, education improves, just the quality of life improves, health improves, and every aspect of life is improved for people. So Dr. King fully understood that. And just that narrative of Dr. King, just like what was in that video clip and just some of the things that I spoke about, is not what is usually digestible and palatable. A democratic socialist who wanted to not only just end integration and get Black people access to the ballot box, but someone who wanted to radically reform. When Dr. King started talking about, and towards the end of his life after 1965, from just reform, but Dr. King started using the word revolution. And he did something, was attempting to do something that hadn't taken place since the 1600s in colonial America. When you got Black and whites and Native Americans and indigenous populations of poor people coming together to challenge the power structure. That didn't happen since Bacon's Rebellion in the 1600s. And we know as a result of that we start coming up with race theories, and we start classifying race, and we start doing things to divide, because the power structure knows the danger that resides in not just Black people coming together to solidarity, but American people coming to solidarity to challenge power itself. And that is not the narrative that is desired to be seen of Dr. King in our classrooms and history books. But we must make a move forward to really start to create that new narrative of Dr. King, and just really understand just how powerful and bold and courageous he was. And as we go into May, we're going to unpack the life and legacy of Malcolm X. And we see that publicly their approaches were disparate or different, but at the same time, their ideologies were more the same than different.
Thank you, Brian. Closing comments, Dr. Robinson.
Thank you. So thank you, Brian. That was really insightful. I was talking back to you the whole time. I just want you to know, I don't know if you heard me, but But it just brings to mind one of my favorite quotes, which happens to be by Malcolm. And that is, you need to make sure you look for yourself, hear for yourself, and think for yourself, or you'll find yourself loving your enemies and hating your friends. And so that's what this series is about. And I'm so thankful to you, Brian, and to you, Latasha, for making this really happen, and having this shared through social media and saved on YouTube. So this is fantastic. Let's keep it going.
All right, excellent, excellent. And it does me great pleasure to be able to be a part of this African American history, as I am too learning some things that I have not learned in the past. So I appreciate you, Brian, for sharing your knowledge. It is very impactful, and I'm sure everybody out there is gaining those nuggets to move forward. I came to the conclusion that there is an existential moment in your life where you must decide to speak for yourself. Nobody else can speak for you. Tune in next month for more of our history, our culture. I'm Latasha Clemens, the host, the first vice president of the National Coalition of 100 Black Women. On behalf of the Coalition of Black Student Achievement, NCBW, South Palm Beach County Chapter, and West Palm Beach County, Unify, and the Palm Beach County School District, we thank you for tuning in with us. Hope you enjoyed the series. See you next month. Good night, everybody.
Peace.